Annastacia Palaszczuk has resigned before she was deposed. She saw the writing was on the wall for the 2024 Queensland election and decided that it was best to let someone else lose the election and take the blame. Let someone else wear the loss and look like they were the loser, even though it was probably going to be her legacy all along that sunk the Labour Party in 2024. Ultimately, her stepping aside wasn't really that much of a surprise. Annastacia Palaszczuk's government was very much on track to lose, and potentially lose massively. Now, of course, polls this far from an election are not exactly reliable, but they did consistently show that the LNP would win, and win handily. And this wasn't just one poll, it was multiple polls over multiple polling periods. Now, of course, the ALP could have turned things around, at least in theory. After all, the Voice referendum was on track to win until it wasn't. However, polling changed as people became more informed in relation to the Voice. With Annastacia Palaszczuk and her government, people had already made up their mind. They had had years of dealing with Annastacia Palaszczuk, and they had turned on her. People weren't exactly becoming informed about a new thing, they already knew what they were getting and they didn't like it. The LNP would win 52% of the two-party preferred vote according to YouGov, and YouGov was not alone. Annastacia Palaszczuk therefore decided to step aside before she was pushed or before she lost the election. Now, Stephen Miles had declared that he will nominate for Premier. This, of course, wasn't really very much of a surprise either. Stephen Miles issued a rather saccharine statement to this effect. It was replete with the obligatory niceties and the nods to Annastacia Palaszczuk's government. It had some rather interesting highlights. For example, Stephen Miles noted that Annastacia Palaszczuk kept us safe during COVID. However, one wonders whether her behaviour during COVID and the harsh treatment of people within Queensland, amongst other states, was part of the reason people didn't really like her. It appears that she didn't really acknowledge why people were upset. It's one thing to lock people down, it's another thing entirely to do so in a tone-deaf manner that fails to realise why people are upset about being locked down. Stephen Miles also said, "She will be remembered most for the strength of her love for this state and its people." I suspect she will probably not be remembered most for that. I suspect rather she will be remembered for her rather unloved policies and her support for progressive causes such as The Voice. Stephen Miles also states, Annastacia Palaszczuk will go down in history as a great reforming premier. And while it might be true that Annastacia Palaszczuk did quote-unquote reform some things, people didn't exactly like the way she was reforming things. For example, the push toward things such as treaty, which Queenslanders seem to manifestly reject. It seems that Queenslanders weren't exactly very fond of her, even if she was fond of Queensland, as was asserted. It seems that if she was doing some reforms, people didn't exactly like those reforms. Sometimes it's better to do nothing than to make things worse. So if Annastacia Palaszczuk is stepping aside, and this not being very much of a surprise, how exactly did we get here? Well, it's probably death by 1,000 cuts. People were, of course, sick of her as a premier. And it isn't just one thing, and it never really is. Rather, it's the succession of multiple things over time that cause people to just lose patience with her government, to lose faith in the government for having their best interests at heart. It was the push, for example, toward ever more progressive policies, which included treaty and voice. However, as we saw in the Voice referendum, Queenslanders overwhelmingly rejected these, and it was quite vitriolic. Annastacia Palaszczuk tied herself to the Voice, but that was only supported by a very small proportion of the electorate within Queensland. Furthermore, Annastacia Palaszczuk was going to go even further and support a treaty. There are already steps to do this. This would have cost many millions of dollars. It was benchmarked by the government itself to cost many millions of dollars based on the treaties within New Zealand. Queenslanders simply didn't want this. Queenslanders didn't see a need to go out and pay money when there was no obligation to do so anyway. Why would you pay money when you didn't need to do so? Why would you enter into a treaty when there was no obligation to do so? It seemed to be voluntarily making life worse for yourself. That's how Queenslanders interpreted it. So therefore it is no surprise that people weren't fond of those moves. It was not explained to people, and people didn't see why on earth they were going down this path. They didn't see why they were going to spend this money when they simply didn't need to. They didn't see why they needed to spend this money when they were struggling with cost of living pressures and they would have thought the Queensland government should be doing something about the cost of living pressures rather than pursuing these progressive causes. She seemed devoted to inner city priorities to the neglect of the overwhelming majority of Queensland voters. She only grudgingly backed away from the treaty after it was overwhelmingly obvious that Queenslanders absolutely hated the idea. After the voice failed dismally in Queensland, and it was obvious she was going against the wishes of the electorate. She should have known this all along, but it became blindingly clear after the voice result. And this was a massive issue for her, because she tied herself to some of these causes that people loathed. Now, of course, it wasn't just the voice and it wasn't just treaty. These were to some extent the canary in the coal mine for her whole agenda. Her whole overall agenda was simply disliked overall, and people were sick of it. People didn't see a positive to offset the negative. People saw all of these negative policies in her agenda, including things like treaty, including things such as supporting voice, including going along with the Albanese government on many of these things, and they didn't see any positive that could possibly offset this. We can also see this in fiscal policies. For example, there was her asinine and failed attempt to massively hike land taxes. Now, of course, Victoria did this, so Annastacia Palaszczuk is not alone, but certainly it is not popular, and this failed significantly and massively when the New South Wales Premier said that he wouldn't play ball with the Queensland government's proposals. It also became obvious that the attempt to massively hike land taxes would have resulted in an investor exodus. Now, some people might be thinking, why do we care about investors? If the investors sell up, then that means there's more housing for own occupiers. But the problem is what happens over the medium term. Because if the investors don't participate in the market, then housing construction goes way down. Because you need those investors to participate for construction to get off the ground. Without the investors, things are less likely to be built, and you get less housing being built. Therefore, you're going to run into an even greater housing shortage. And therefore, by having this investor exodus, you make the housing crisis even worse. It was a very short-term type proposal, a short-term way to raise revenue with long-term costs, which ultimately needed to be backed down from. And these are just a couple of Annastacia Palaszczuk's truly awful policies, and therefore it is no surprise the Queenslanders have simply lost patience with her. Now, as for whether her successor could turn things around, for example, could Stephen Miles win the election? Well, it certainly is possible in theory. However, it appears to be inherently difficult for him to do so. Now, while the opposition often faces an uphill battle to win a state election, as soon as that incumbent state government starts to become unpopular, well, then the writing seems to be on the wall. Now, typically it takes a catalyst to push things over the edge. For example, in New South Wales, it took Scott Morrison's personal unpopularity to sink Dominic Perrottet. However, the Palaszczuk government has become so unpopular, and so unpopular for so long, that it would appear to be incredibly difficult for them to retain power. Furthermore, it appears to be absurd to think that someone like Stephen Miles could gain traction and win the election by so blatantly trying to tie himself to the Palaszczuk legacy. If people didn't like Annastacia Palaszczuk, then attaching himself to what she did and to her policies is not going to work. But if he's just wheeling out the same policies under a new banner, it isn't going to help. Queenslanders can see through this. Now, of course, maybe he'll get lucky, but I suspect he probably won't. And I suspect that unless he actually reverses course on a lot of the things that people dislike, he's going to have massive problems winning the election. But nevertheless, that's what's happening in Queensland. Let me know your thoughts about whether Annastacia Palaszczuk was right to stand aside. I'd be interested to hear what you think about it in the comments below. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you next time as well.